check, check, check. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. All right, I guess folks are still wandering in a little bit here. We'll give everyone a minute or two more and then we'll dive in. All right, may as well get started here. Thanks for everyone coming by. Today we're going to talk a little bit about not shooting ourselves in our feet, which is something that we in information security tend to do more often than we like. First off, my name is Tyler Strickland. I'm a one of the managers on the detection engineering team at Red Canary. Been there for just over a year. Great company. We get to work with some really cool folks. Fun fact, I've now lived in Provo 4 times in my life. I can't escape the place, or it can't escape me. I'm not quite sure which. But it's good to be back. It's been 15 years now. And before we dive into the content, I have a warning for you all. Some of this may trigger flashbacks of experiences you may have experienced. Some of it may also trigger feelings of guilt, because none of us are perfect in some of these areas. So just to be warned, you may need to have some of your heart medication nearby. It's a hard subject. So let's talk about a story. So in a past life, I managed vulnerability management. And for any of you that's managed vulnerability management, you know that it can be sometimes a knockdown, drag-out fight to try to protect an organization. And when I joined that organization, there really wasn't much of a vulnerability management program. Effectively, we were asking the system administrators to log into our vulnerability management tool, find the vulnerabilities they needed to fix, and go fix them. And you can imagine that probably didn't work out so well. And it didn't. No one ever fixed anything. And over the course of the next several years, we spent a lot of time thinking and working toward trying to build a vulnerability management program that actually worked within the organization that we were operating. And in the end, we did. We were fixing 80-90% of vulnerabilities within our SLA. And some of the foundations of how we built that program and other aspects of our information security program are what kind of drove me to look into this topic or think a lot about this topic. So today we're going to talk a bit about some symptoms of relationship issues between information security and the rest of the organization. We're going to talk about a root cause for that or something that might be leading to some of these symptoms. And then we'll talk about some treatments, some things that we can do to make things a little bit better than they are today. So first off, we're going to talk about symptoms that we see in our partners. Next, we'll come back and talk about symptoms we see in ourselves. It really does feel sometimes like other teams do scurry away when InfoSec comes to call, right? Because we bring that pen test report, we bring that list of vulnerabilities, we bring that big project that perhaps is going to take away from them delivering on one of their key deliverables. Or we're asking them to make a big change to that major endeavor that is going to make or break their quarterly goals. So let's talk about some symptoms here. Number one, deprioritization. Sometimes it feels like anything that we ask of other teams just goes really slowly, right? Either some other project is more important or their resources are prioritized elsewhere. We just can't get the support we need in the time we need it. You want to fix that vulnerability in a month? Give me 3, right? Sometimes things just don't flow the way that we hope or expect them to. Or other things that we look at as not being critical to the business or definitely not to security get prioritized. But dark mode, have to have dark mode. At the same time, we're trying to get them to fix this SQL injection that could get you hacked any minute now, right? Number 2, avoidance. This is the part where they kind of maybe run away from us or they forget to call us, right? So there's this major project that's happening, this thing that's going to drive the business going forward. And we hear about it 6 months in, after it's already been designed, the requirements are decided upon, we have a date, we've already made the press release, and InfoSec, by the way, you should probably know about this, but don't change anything, please. Don't change anything because that's going to impact our delivery date. They maybe leave us out of important discussions about systems to buy or decisions to make about how to design certain aspects of the system. I've even seen cases where other teams within the organization have tried to hire their own security people so they didn't have to work with us, right? So the infrastructure security liaison or administrator, right? So then if you want to talk to them, no, you go to that security person. They have to, somehow sit between you and the business. We don't find about problems till they are a big problem. They've exploded. Instead of being something we can fix in 5 minutes, they take 5 weeks or 5 months, right? Symptom number 3, blissful ignorance. Maybe they just don't care. They're not interested in learning about information security or how it impacts their job, or denial that whatever they're doing has any security implications. But I need to put that dev server on the internet in order to work with our partner. I have to. It's the only way to do it, and it has to be done yesterday. which is why it's already up there and you're just now finding out about it, even though it has RDP exposed to the internet and we're getting attacked left and right. Anyone have that experience? What do you mean I shouldn't click on every link in every email? That's my job. I've heard that, right? It is my job to open every attachment and click on every link. And you know what? Sometimes it may be, actually. That terrifies us in information security. And symptom number 4, outright hostility. Maybe they're not just slowing down security initiatives, but they're actively working against them. We tell them what best practice is, and they say they don't care. They want nothing to do with best practice because in their mind, they just have to get that product delivered. You do your job. I'll do mine. I even saw one occasion where an executive level person told their team, do not talk to information security. Only managers, only senior leadership gets to talk to information security because they're getting in our way, they're getting on our turf. Obviously, that does not lead to good security outcomes. In fact, it often leads to things like attrition. It leads to companies having major security issues down the road. If things have devolved to outright hostility, there are big problems that are happening. Now let's talk about some symptoms that we see within the information security team itself. First off, an us versus them mentality. And I want to say this before I dive into these. I'm as guilty as most of these as probably anyone is. We've all done it. We've all experienced some of these symptoms. We need to be honest about that with ourselves. Sometimes we feel like we're better than those teams we're working with. I know Windows administration better than the Windows administrators. And you know what? There are some tiny little aspects of it where I may, but I definitely can't do their job. We view IT as a roadblock. Bonus points out there for anyone who's heard of the BOFH. I encourage you to do some Googling and read some really hilarious stories from the early days of the pre-internet. The bastard operator from hell is about the bastard operator administrator from hell. But we view IT as being a whole bunch of people that are bad at their jobs and they're getting in the way of security. We start talking about PEBCAC and losers. And all of that builds up walls and barriers between us and those teams. I spent some time in the Navy. I was an electronics technician. My job was to fix the electronic equipment that other teams used. We weren't users. We didn't use most of the things that we worked on. We had to make sure it was functional and fix it when it broke. And there was a tendency among a lot of these electronics technicians when there's a position in the Navy called an operations specialist. They're the ones who operate radars, right? We would fix the radar, they would operate it, and they would have a problem with it. And they'd call us and say it's broken. We'd come up there and like, you got this switch wrong. We'd flip the switch and treat them like an idiot. And you know what? The next time it broke, they didn't call us. Or when something was really broken, they definitely didn't call us because we were just going to blame it on them. That's not how you build relationships. Threatening to have them fired for things. It doesn't help either. But it happens. It happens a lot. How many of you have seen when someone proposing that someone fails 3 phishing tests and that they should have some sort of a penalty, like an official on-the-record penalty? That doesn't help. They're going to be scared. They're going to be skittish with anything that information security is involved with. Next, bubbles and walls. We kind of wall ourselves off from the organization sometimes. We are perhaps afraid that they'll get in the way of what we're doing. We may not consider the impact of our actions, of our projects, our proposals, our requirements on those teams. We throw our requests, really demands over the wall and say, hey, this is what you have to do, figure it out. You see that often in vulnerability management programs, right? You run the scan, you come up with a list of 70,000 vulnerabilities, you export it to Excel, You hand it to them and say, fix them. Go. You have a month. We'll scan it again in a month. If you haven't fixed them, well, you're in trouble. It happens far more frequently than most of us like to admit. Another one, you can't go live without this particular control. Security architecture, there's probably a few security architects in the room. We want to have, APT level protection on a lot of these applications. And so we'll sometimes block applications from going live without particular controls or things in place. And at the same time, across the table, they're kind of quaking in their boots saying, but I have to deliver tomorrow or next week. No, I'm not arguing that they're in the right, but I'm also not arguing that we are. There are some problems under the covers there. Next, smoke and mirrors. Who here has used FUD to drive security programs? I think most of us have, to some degree or another, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt are something that get used for and against us all the time. We use it in our trainings. We use it in meetings to get our way. We also sometimes try to obscure what we're doing, being afraid that they're going to get in the way of a particular security program, right? Oh, but if I install that agent on there and tell them really what that agent's going to do, because most EDR tools are actually remote access Trojans, right? If we tell them what that agent can actually do, they'll actually stop it. They'll get in our way. Or my favorite, the APTs are coming. And I hope that little pew-pew chart here doesn't cause trauma in anyone. But sometimes we do act like that is what's happening. We give them metrics that say, we stopped 50,000 attacks yesterday because our firewall blocked 50,000 packets. And then finally, but mommy said so, or in our terms usually, but the CEO said so, or the board said so. We feel like the only way that we can get anything done is through coercion. We're forcing them, right? I was at a company that was a close partner with another company that had a breach. A big company, I won't say the name, really, really big healthcare company, and we worked very closely with them. And so our mandate was to get it right in security. And you know what? That's the starting point for some discussions, but it can't be the ending point. So some of you might argue that these things, what I'm calling symptoms, are actually causes, right? These things that we do are causing those symptoms I've listed for our partners. And you know what? You're probably right. They are causes. But they're not the root cause for a lot of this. I want to propose a root cause that perhaps underlies some of, if not much of these issues that we experience. Because most of these are, in the end, self-inflicted wounds. So, to talk about that root cause, I want to set some fundamental truths here. First off, most of the people we're working with within IT and within the business are good people trying to do their jobs. They're not hacking the company. There are some that are. Most of us have dealt with insider threats that really are trying to hack the company from the inside. I've had to deal with those. They're not fun. They're the least favorite part of my job. But most of them are fundamentally good people trying to do their job. And some of them are really good at it, and some of them are not as good at it. Just like in information security, we're fundamentally, generally good people. Not all of us. There's been some CISOs that went a little bit off the wire, if you read some of these news stories over the years. But most of us are good people trying to do good things to protect our organization. Similarly, some of us are really smart and some of us are not so smart. Some of us are really good at our job, some of us are not as good at our job, right? We're all normal, good people trying to do good things. Unfortunately, our actions don't always reflect that good intent. Some of the things we do, so like those symptoms we just walked through, may not reflect the intent of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to protect an organization, but starting to talk about PEBCAC doesn't necessarily reflect that intent. I would posit that one of the reasons we behave the way we do is that we are at war and we feel like it. Our organizations really are under siege from invisible attackers that can attack from anywhere, at any time, from any angle. It can be a USB dropped in the parking lot, an exploit against a website, an email that gets sent in. It can be physical attacks, though I'd argue those probably happen less than most of the rest of these. Attacks can really come from anywhere. We are truly under siege. And what that means is we view ourselves in some way, shape, or form as soldiers, right? Or security guards, or whatever metaphor you want to use. We're there protecting the organization in sometimes very literal physical ways, right? If we're pulling an all-nighter trying to respond to a particular vulnerability, right, we are putting our body right there trying to get that vulnerability addressed. And so we align with this mission, and most of us are very deeply committed to that mission. It hurts us when we're not able to protect our organization. It hurts us when someone clicks on that email, when someone gets on the phone with that pen tester to very kindly help them install malware onto their system. That hurts us at our core. Because of this, we tend to be very distrustful by nature, right? Most of the people in the company, by their job, are trained to be trusting and to work with each other and be really nice. And we're telling them, don't trust anyone. And that's hard to take for some people. We also have this constant sense of urgency. Everything has to be done right now, or the attackers are going to get us, the APTs are coming. Now, sometimes these things really do need to be done right now. There's no question about that. But in our work, almost everything has that sense of urgency to it. And we come to build this mindset where those who do not cooperate with us, who do not have the same commitment to the mission that we do, are our enemies. If you're not with us, you're against us. All's fair in love and war, right? We kind of use that mission to build up that us versus them mentality. And so, because of that view, there are things that we do that will push away our partners. So I'm going to take, we talked about symptoms earlier, so let's take it to a higher level. These people that should be our allies often end up our enemies. And here are some reasons why that happens. At a fundamental level, we tend to do some basic things. We run roughshod over our obstacles, focus on the mission more than the people. We don't always follow our own advice. How many of you have said, you have to go through this security assessment process before your website goes live, and then turned around and sent your own information security website live without going through that process? I think a lot of us have. Sometimes we're even kind of jerks about things, right? We're not that nice sometimes. So, what are some of the things that fall along these lines? Number one, poor communication. We don't necessarily share our needs, our plans, our goals with those partners in IT or in the business. They don't understand what we're trying to do or why we're trying to do it. Along the same lines, we don't care or try to understand what they're trying to do or why they're trying to do it. Going back to the dark mode example, they may be doing it just because it looks cool. They may be doing it because one of their biggest customers said, if you don't get dark mode, I'm dropping you. I hope not. That's kind of crazy. But things along those lines happen all the time. And if we don't understand why they're doing what they do, we can ask them to do some things that simply don't make sense from their perspective. We've got to talk to each other instead of at each other. We've got to listen. Next, requirements. Following similar lines, if we're not talking to them, we don't understand why they're trying to do what they're doing or what they're trying to do. We may sometimes give them requirements that don't make sense from their perspective. If we look at that vulnerability management program example I gave earlier, we hand someone 70,000 vulnerabilities and say fit it in, their plate's already full, in their minds at least, right? We're saying do so much more with the time that you have. Now, we're always saying that. We're always going to be saying that. But the way we say it matters a lot. And if we don't work with them to understand the implications of our requirements on what they're trying to do, we can end up with some very grumpy people, with some enemies instead of allies. Sometimes we put requirements down that don't necessarily align with risk. They may feel arbitrary or onerous to the people that are receiving them. Now, they may not be arbitrary or onerous. We may have very good, solid logic for them. But are we communicating that to them clearly in a way that they understand from their perspective? I don't think that we do all that often. We struggle with that in information security. And again, going back to requirements that we don't necessarily keep ourselves, we can be some pretty big hypocrites in information security sometimes. And that burns relationships. That causes us to lose trust with our partners. One example of that was an architecture team that I knew that used an opportunity of a database upgrade to say, we need to revisit your entire database architecture. So the database team's walking in saying, we just need to upgrade from version 11 to version 12. And it's going to take so many hours over so much time. And information security comes in and says, ooh, this is a great opportunity. We haven't been able to look at our Oracle databases to see if they're configured properly. Let's do that now. It's only going to double your time and your budget, but that's okay, right? And then we are surprised when they get upset or they struggle with what we're asking of them. Next, bad processes. Sometimes we're just throwing things at them without a good, well-thought-out process that actually works. We look back at that vulnerability management program I talked about that existed when I first arrived at this company. There was no process. It didn't work. They hadn't agreed to anything. In time, once we built a good process that their leadership, especially their senior leadership, C-suite leadership, had agreed to, it made it much easier to be successful in executing that process. Because we're not going up to random system administrator and saying, all right, you got to patch your system tomorrow. No, we're doing something that's normal, that's expected, that their leadership has bought into in ways that perhaps they may not have in the past. You know, something that tends to go along these lines is, we like to put our web application review steps right at the very end of the process, the end of application development, before they go live. And then that process somehow ends up taking 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. And they're sitting there, sweat pouring off of their faces because the press release says they're going to deliver on a date. If they can't deliver on the date, they don't get their bonus, they lose their job. All right? We don't understand that. We don't think about that. But it happens. And that's why the next item, risk assessment gaps. This kind of falls along the same lines of requirements, but when we don't measure risk or we don't communicate risk to them clearly, or our risk decisions don't match up with what works in their brain, we can lose trust. Example, say every 2 weeks, when the latest Chrome update drops, it's emergency patching time. Oh, because every single Chrome update is critical. Every single one. In fact, just about every single browser update is critical, if you look at the CVSS score. But if you have to say the sky is falling every 2 weeks because Chrome's getting updated, but no one's actually getting hacked, it's not actually impacting the business, you may be losing trust. We also don't think about acceptable risk. In our business, in the IT world, there's no way to eliminate all risk. We have to be able to accept some amount of risk. Now, that should be an educated decision made by the people who have the authority to make that decision. But often in information security, we don't like to accept any at all. And that makes us the house of no. Anything comes to you, nope. I said, it is our way or the highway. And in the end, if that's how it works, they're going to take the back roads and they're just going to skip us altogether. So let's talk about a few treatments. How can we do better here? There are some behaviors that along the way can help us to build a stronger relationship with our partners that's founded on trust. Number one, respect. We need to show them respect. If we go into better than thou, greater than thou, holier than thou mentality with our partners, we're building those walls up. They're going to try to run away and run around us. We need to assume that they have positive intent. We may not understand their intentions. We may not understand their incentives, and we'll talk about that later. But we need to assume that they're starting from a good point. They're not always, and that's okay. And we can deal with those moments when we need to. But we need to assume positive intent. That's hard. I've seen security architecture teams who are in the throes of a warfare, or at least what they felt like was warfare, where in their minds every application developer out there had very negative intent. I don't believe that was the case. I think they had built up a negative relationship over time to where neither side trusted each other at all, and nothing got done. If we treat them as allies instead of enemies, if we bring them into our meetings, ask for their opinions, their ideas, ask them to help designing solutions, we might actually learn something. Next, communication. We need to shut up and listen sometimes. I've heard, I'm not a CISO, I've never been a CISO, but I've heard that one of the most valuable things a CISO can do is to walk into their peers' offices and shut up and listen to what their peers care about. And I believe that. If we are trying to understand what our peers care about, what drives their business, what they're trying to do, what their roadmap looks like, and then using that to inform our roadmap and our decision and our design points, the likelihood of our success goes through the roof. We need to have honest and direct conversations with them about risk. And we need to listen to them when they push back about some of our risk assessments, because sometimes they're actually right. When I first took over this vulnerability management program, I was relatively new to the security industry, and I went down the Chrome is an emergency patch road. And I was fortunate to have a system administrator that sat me down and said, Tyler, is that really the case? Is it really an emergency patch? And when I sat down and really thought about it, I had to be honest with myself and say, no, it wasn't. Now, is it something we need to prioritize and make sure we get out there in a reasonable amount of time? Sure. It's not an emergency, though. And a lot of the things that we call emergencies really aren't. One of my big struggle with the common vulnerability scoring system that we use today is that we don't think as often as we should about environmental risk. we don't think about the specifics of how that particular risk impacts us in the organization. We see CVSS 9.8 or 10, depending which version of CVSS you're using, and we scream, patch now or we're going to die. But most of the time, that's not actually the case. We also need to help them understand how their implications and how their actions impact risk. I've seen a few cases where when we talked through the output of, say, a penetration test, and say, because of this, the attackers were able to do that, and maybe go straight to an example in the code or on the system. I remember there was a major vulnerability years ago that impacted our backup systems. And the vulnerability was so reliable, or I should say the POC was so reliable, that I could type out a single line of code and have hit enter and be root on whatever backup system I wanted to be. Doing that in front of them and saying this is the risk, I'll tell you, some backup admins were scrambling to try to get that fixed because we brought it home to them. If we can help them understand where we're coming from, it makes a huge difference in their willingness to work with us. Same thing with any penetration test output. A big one nowadays that a lot of organizations are struggling with is credentials stored in source code repositories. If you can run a scan and show that there are 50 credentials out there that work to get into your AWS environment, etc., that can open some eyes and perhaps help them understand why we're doing what we're doing. Next, we need to consider their incentives. What is driving what they do? What does their bonus depend on? Will their boss deny their bonus if they don't deliver a particular project on time? And InfoSec is jumping in saying, no, 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 you can't do that. There's no way you're going to deliver that on time because we have our requirements. Now, sometimes that's the right answer. It's not always, though. What does their boss care about? Because most of the time, they care about what their boss cares about. Our infrastructure team, there were two things that he cared about. Was email up? Was the internet up? If either of those was answered in the negative, it was all hands on deck. So can you help the boss care about what you care about? Can you speak to them in terms of what their boss cares about? A lot of the time it's availability, for infrastructure teams at least, right? Well, availability is on the CIA triad. And if we talk in terms of availability, it can help convey our message. But change absolutely starts at the top. Those incentives need to come from the top, ideally from the C-suite, if not the CEO. Next, we need to look inward. We need to look at our processes to be honest with ourselves about whether those processes actually work. Are they doable? Do they actually address risk? Or are they simply something to make a compliance person smile and nod, right? Now, we have to do our compliance things. There's no question about it. But how many of these are paper exercises, and how many of them actually impact risk? Let's be honest with ourselves about that. Are the things that we're asking of them realistic? Are they really going to have the time to do this? Do we understand how they're going to impact things? And are our risk assessments accurate? If the sky is always falling, it's never falling. Crying wolf doesn't work after the first time or two. We lose trust. And number 5, help them look good. If we make them look good, then they're going to be incentivized to help us. A number of years ago, some of you may remember a particular Citrix NetScaler vulnerability that became a big thing right before Christmas. This was somewhere around 2019 period, I think. And this was the real deal. This was something that was easily exploitable. NetScaler, a lot of the time, is on the internet by design. It's just what it does. And so we ended up having to ask our Citrix administrators to work on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day to patch this vulnerability. And you know what? It hurt me to do that, because that's the last thing I want to have to ask of anyone. But we did, and they did. We got the vulnerability patch, and within 2 weeks, organizations throughout the globe were getting hacked through this vulnerability. It was the real deal. But when we limit what we're doing to the real deal, we can make a lot of difference. Now, that Citrix admin who was working those long hours on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and a couple days afterwards, we were fortunate that we had an internal program to be able to give a spot bonus to someone. We were able to give that person $500 to say thank you. That same person, a year or two later, reported pen testers out of the blue. They saw something weird, and they challenged the pen testers and helped us block what they were trying to do. These things work. If we can win allies across the company, they will tell us things are broken early, and we can fix them before it's too hard to fix them. Some of you may be thinking, but Tyler, does that mean we have to be a pushover? No, it doesn't. Not at all. We can still be hard on problems while being nice to people. Do we have to condone bad behavior? Absolutely not. Please don't. But we can condone bad behavior while fighting day and night against the true threat actors that are out there. Will this lead to worse security outcomes? Well, sometimes being mean gets you results really quickly, but that tends to die off even quicker. If we can build these relationships, the end result will be far, far better than it would have been if we were jerks about it. So, in summary, most people are good. InfoSec is hard. It's dang hard. Relationships are hard too. But if we approach things from this mentality of we're in a war, they're blocking our battles, they're enemies, then that will sabotage what we're trying to do. If we treat them like allies, if we help them to understand where we're coming from, and we try to understand where they're coming from, we're going to win a lot more than we fail. And we're probably going to win a lot more than we do today. So, just be excellent to each other. That's really all you need to do. We'll leave a couple moments for questions or thoughts if anyone has them. Final note here, I work for Red Canary. This isn't a sales pitch. I love their core values. They try to do what's right for the customer, and we are kind and authentic. And that is a value that I have seen demonstrated day in and day out. If you want to learn more about this topic or review some of the stuff I've talked about, I wrote a blog entry to go along with this. If you go to redcanary.com/SAINTCON, you'll find that blog. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. So I'll open it up if anyone would like to throw anything out. All right, go ahead. Favorite books is the question. I would say one that I'm actually reading through right now that I find a really good example of this is Radical Candor. Radical Candor is about combining being direct with people when they need it with really showing them respect and kindness along the way. I think it is a strong approach to solving problems in ways that don't burn relationships. Another thing I'll recommend is actually learning about negotiation. I had an employer that was kind enough to send me to a negotiation course for my annual personal development a few years ago, and that absolutely changed how I saw working with our partners. That's really where the point about thinking about incentives comes from. You can negotiate far better if you understand the incentives that are driving our other people. So another question? Yep. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you communicate these priorities outside of security? Outside of IT. I think these principles align to that perfectly. And what I mean when I say that is, if we go to, say, a manufacturing boss and we try to understand what's driving them and what their goals are, and then we start talking about how security can impact those goals and how we can help with those goals, I think we find that we have a lot in common. You know, there may be heavily focused on certain aspects of it, and we may need to tune our approach to certain things to meet what they're trying to do. Obviously, operational technology is its own beast and requires its own approach, but you know, in a hospital environment, in a any sort of environment that isn't focused on technology, those same core values can apply. If we show respect to our peers, if we're trying to understand where they're coming from, and we communicate with them, if we listen, I think we can achieve a lot. Any other thoughts or questions out there? Oh, go ahead. So the question is, how do we incentivize security incident reporting? I think there are a few ways we can do that. One of them can be to help them understand the impact of security incidents, maybe have demonstrations of things that are happening. When they click that link, what actually happens. You know, get one of your red team guys maybe, or a red team person if you want to bring in a consultant. This is what happens when you click that phishing link. Another way is to talk about maybe some of their personal challenges and how it impacts them personally. And there was for an education program a couple of years ago, we talked about how to secure passwords and focused, but on people's personal passwords at home, how they could use, I think we were talking about KeyPass at the time. And there was a tremendous amount of interest because people are worried about hackers getting into their bank account. And so if we can talk to them in terms of the things that they care about, in terms of their day-to-day business, and help them to really understand the attacks that they're going to see and the types of things they might observe, I think it can help. One of the things that I think it was the second keynote we had this morning talked about. A lot of our training doesn't necessarily align with the attacks that people actually see. I think if we can align that training to the things that they're going to encounter in their day-to-day business, and especially stuff that they can encounter in their personal lives, that will make a big difference there. All right, any other final thoughts? We're at the last 5 minutes here. If not, we'll close it out. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. I'll be around the next few days, either walking around or hanging out at the Red Canary booth. Would love to chat with you. Good.
Check. Checking 1, 2, 3. I don't know if his voice is as loud as mine or not, so. Check.
Saturday Night Live, if you've ever heard this, Bill Murray. It's a good episode. Really is. Does anyone watch Saturday Night Live anymore? How's that?
I think it's only on
Saturday Night Live. It's only on you. No one does. Back in the days, though, Bill Murray. We're good.
everyone. Can you hear me okay? Maybe, yes, no? Can't hear me at all. How about now? Nope. I'm still getting head nods up a little bit. We're good. All right.
I'll check this one. Oh, yeah.
That's right. And we were trying to figure out what is this mic. Is it Taylor Swift, Madonna? And then someone said that, Taylor Swift doesn't have a beard, but we sort of questioned, does Madonna have a beard? Anyone agree? It's a bad joke, I know, and would say dad joke. What I'd love to do is invite you to come forward if you would like to. We think that the 4:30 slot means that it's going to be a bit sparse. If you want to sit in back, that's still fine. It's still okay. What I'd like to do is just invite everyone to participate. We're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. But what we'd like to do is leave you with at least an understanding of how to approach zero trust. So before I start, I'd love to get a raise of hands. How many have zero trust initiatives in their company today? Anyone? How many are familiar with the concept? How many are not familiar with the concept, maybe is a better way to say it. Okay, we have a good mix, I think. We have some that are in projects, some are familiar with it, and some not. Well, as we go through this, I hope to leave you with at least an understanding of what the elements are to zero trust. You'll hear a lot of companies say that it's just about the network, but it's more than that. And hopefully we'll leave you with an understanding of how identity-centric approach to zero trust gives you a lot of flexibility, as well as gets you to really some of the goals and the approaches that are necessary. Would also like to make sure that you have an approach, meaning where do I start? We have a lot of our organizations and companies we work with that just say, I don't even know where to start, and we'll hopefully give you a framework to do that. And then we'll talk about how to take that journey. So once I have the framework, once I've done an assessment, and then we'll give you a pathway to get there. Sound good? Look for head nods? All right. So first thing I'd like to get into is really what are some of the goals? And if I go quickly through this, the goal is really just about how can I provide as granular of control to the access to the resources I possibly can. It's really about the more information I have and know about someone, the better I can protect then the resources they have at a very granular level. If you look about the approach, there's a lot of discussion going on in the security arena where if you provide security in a centralized fashion, you start to gain that centralized control, but what it does is take some of that control away from the app owner. What's been happening as we look at standard, as we look at different new technologies, you'll hopefully see through this approach that you can actually take a centralized approach to a policy. It's almost a policy as code kind of an approach. And then you move enforcement close to the app. And so once you look at this, your goal is to get as granular as you possibly can, and then the approach is centralized with enforcement distributed. Now, if you take the next step, it's really about starting with some of the principles. So first off, there's 3 principles to zero trust. The first is that it doesn't matter what network you're on, doesn't matter if it's inside or outside the firewall, the network no longer can protect from insider threat. You really have threat from external identities as well as internal identities. You also have the case where public networks really and private networks are almost the same. We talked to a lot of our customers that do a lot of their business operations out on the net. They consume SaaS services as well as they keep things internal, and they're roughly treating them the same. And then last is just to admit to us that we need a change and that we need to have continual assessment to be able to ensure that you understand the security framework, the security foundation of your platform. So what that really does, what it means then is I have to first manage all of the devices and users that come in. I have to verify those devices and users. I also have to authenticate and authorize access to those devices and users to the resources that I'm protecting. And in a more modern fashion, it's not only just about authenticating and authorizing, but I have to continually assess, continually monitor the access for them. And that's really done through an orchestration layer that you'll see in some of the frameworks we'll get to. Yeah.
Something I want to add is, for those who haven't really heard of zero trust or aren't looking or haven't had any background on that, how many people have heard of ransomware? Okay, so the same principles that apply to mitigating ransomware are the same principles that will apply to zero trust. So if you're having a problem with ransomware, or you think you're going to, or you want to find out whether you're going to be vulnerable towards a ransomware type attack, these same principles apply to preventing those attacks. So I like to put, when I talk with a lot of customers, they want, they can see that better than, well, why zero trust? Why do I need to control the identity and to control the device and to control the network? I mean, that's really hard, but why? And these principles will help them with ransomware. It makes it a lot easier to explain to be able to, implement this.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think there's a lot of metaphors. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll find that the frameworks can apply to all kinds of attacks and all kinds of threat vectors. One thing also we wanted to bring to bear is there is this discussion in the industry. How many have raised a hand, understand, or have heard of zero trust network access? Sort of. How many have heard of zero trust identity access? A few of you? And I think there's two different lenses out in the market. And as you talk through your zero trust strategy, there really isn't one approach. I think you have to look at a balanced model. If you look at the network-centric approach, they really are about establishing implicit trust to be able to control either information going out or information coming in. When you look at an identity-centric approach, it's really about defining least privileges and be able to ensure that you have the granularity that's required. Now, you look at also then with those two different philosophies, it's really about how do I best protect resources, and it's just not web apps anymore, it's APIs, it's data, it's access to particular information either via consent authorization or the organization granting trust or granting access to that. So if we take that balance between the network as well as the identity, it really is simplified down into 4 different steps. You first have to manage the device. So you've got to trust them and manage them to enable a user to be able to get onto them. Then you have to authenticate. So if you are strongly authenticating a user and you ensure that that device is managed and secured and paired with that identity, you start to develop that initial trust. Second, you have to dynamically authorize. Anyone know what that means? Anyone want to take a guess? Just shout it out. What? MFA, so strongly authenticate is more on the MFA, and when I talk about dynamic authorization, it's really about bringing intelligence, bringing information into that authorization process. So I know who you are, and I've granted you access, but now I want to be able to ensure, based on the latest contextual information, what you can and can't do. And then last is just to ensure that your enforcement, it sits at the edge. So that's really taking all those principles and breaking down into manage the devices, pair them to an authenticated user, authenticate who they are, make sure you have the latest contextual risk information about the user before you grant access to that resource that's protected by the network. Now, if you look at one of the fundamental principles is that you've got to look at your full ecosystem. I remember having a conversation with one of our partners, Microsoft, and they said, yeah, we can do it all. And the more we peeled the onion, we started to say, well, not really. You may have some network or infrastructure security service. You may have some identity services. You may even have a way to manage devices. But the thing you're missing is really a full layer strategy around that. And so at Ping, we talk quite often about identity is really at the center. And then there's relationships established with the various layers within the environment. Now, when we were looking at a zero trust strategy, we did a few things. We said, all right, then let's take identity at the center, and then what kind of relationships do we need to have? Some of it leverages identity technologies, others work with other providers. This is just a map, it's a bit of an eye chart for those in the back. But that mapping gives you a sense of those things that are identity-centric, things that get to know who you are. We verify who you are. We give you MFA capabilities to strongly authenticate who you are, and then we give you the ability to protect those resources. But what do you do when it comes down to, I want to make sure that this phone's been jailbroken or not? I need some kind of managed service, or I want to apply DLP to that device. I want to be able to secure the network at the edge. I want to be able to secure at the edge before they access a SaaS app. Those all require an ecosystem to work together by this framework. Now, if you go to that next step then, as you look at those things that Ping provided, were all very identity-centric, and we'll talk a little bit later about the journey that you would take with Ping, as well as in how do we connect to some of these partners. But this just gives you a map of our view of the ecosystem. Now, how many of you have vendors that are up on the board in your network? There's some of those vendors downstairs, and you can talk to them. And so take BeyondTrust, for example. They're very strong in privileged access management. a key component to be able to secure access to your infrastructure, something that is, working well together with ping. You can start to provide, very strong authentication. You can ensure that that privileged account has the right level of protection to protect the resources that they're getting into. So once you look then at that domain, those are all the players, all the different categories essentially within a zero trust framework. Then you need to break down the domains. And those domains are again on that identity realm, device realm that we talked about before. But you can see now that it's identities pairing with the device before they can access the application, the data, or the service. And then what does the network do in helping protect access either to those resources that are inside the firewall versus outside? And so we translated that all into a reference architecture. So consider an identity-centric reference architecture really does start then with two things kind of as core. The first is an authentication authority, and that sits in the middle and does a few things. Anyone, again, back to the MFA question, does an authentication authority manage what kind of authentication types, what kind of authentication methods are used? Yes, thank you, head nod. So an authentication authority is really there to help adjudicate decisions. And so I remember I was at a large airline one time and they said, we have 40 different roles, and some of them are on the tarmac, some are agents at the desk, some are pilots that are disconnected in the airplane. They all need to authenticate strongly, but we need a bunch of different methods. Some of them are doing it offline, some of them are doing it on a kiosk, some of them need to use a glove, and so it's a different kind of method that they're authenticating. And that authentication authority sits in the middle of that and helps manage which type of authentication is required. Dynamic authorization is the same, because that authorization is really the policy administration and decision point for determining, who and what and under what context they can access a specific resource. And then orchestration really sits underneath to help manage that user experience. We'll talk a little bit later there. Anything to add, Steve? Or?
Yeah, I think a good example for this will be hospitals, because hospitals don't want to spend a dime unless it's going to make healthcare to patients easier. And so being able to use kind of an automatic authentication, they can log in and do their multi-factor one time, but they want to be able to go from kiosk to kiosk, in different rooms and just do like a one touch on their badge. So maybe every 2 hours they're going to re-authenticate, but you want to make, on the end user, you still want to make it as easy as possible for them, because when security starts getting too difficult for the users, then they just don't want to do it. They're going to find a way to get around it every time.
Yeah, thank you. So consider then the reference architecture or all the piece parts. It's not quite a deployment architecture, but at least talks about the pieces that are there. The next thing I wanted to bring up is considering the user. Something that happened, I think, during the lockdown was it really shifted the value of the end user. So consider an employee used to be treated like, okay, it's good enough security. Well, that's changed. Once they went remote, they started to act a whole lot more like a partner or a customer. And so you look at Zero Trust then is really about, how can I leverage the best security and technology and create the best user experience? And what's been interesting is by bringing both together, having the right pieces and then the right experience, you actually can improve that security. Now, a few examples of that is that verification now, it's very easy to leverage online verification technology using live selfie match against your driver's license or passport and be able to onboard someone in a self-service flow. Consider then profile management allows you to do progressive profiling, where you may know a little bit about a user, but over time as you get to know them better, you can start to grant more access. All again, better user experiences as we go forward. Take authentication, authorization. We talked about them of just requiring a lot of different factors and authorization to be able to ensure what they can get to. And then you have some legacy systems. You also need to manage what they're entitled to. That's either by managing groups, managing attributes about those users, or distributing, essentially sending group information down to the application so they can secure it. So the last two ones are really where we then start to bring in a little more of that network layer and level of access control. It's now how do I protect? And so can I get signals? Can I get feeds from my client device? Or can I get signals from the network that tell me what that posture is, tell me what the risk level is there? Then be able to detect if there is anomalistic behavior or there are threats, and then be able to respond and react to that. And so it's really that user experience, walking them through that Zero Trust security framework that's worth considering. Yeah, please.
Add to that, the detect and respond is really important with that. Again, I like to roll things back into a why. Why do we do things? I was that irritating kid that was always asking why. And so when we're looking at that detect and respond and putting that into the entire big picture, it's like, again, going back to ransomware. If somebody clicks on a link and then they end up getting, allowing somebody onto their machine, the first thing they're going to do is try to, enumerate the network and find out what other machines they can get on using those credentials. Well, if they don't have MFA, they're pretty much stopped right there. But you also want to have that detect and respond to know that, hey, something's happening here where this user is trying to move from this machine to this machine, but not in a normal way or not in a normal behavior. So that's kind of the why behind that last slide.
Yeah, that's great. And this is really just that next stage of take that last slide, bring in that flow, a user experience across that, and then how do some of those technologies relate? So hopefully I'm giving you the way to connect to from the elements, the piece parts, down to the actual user experience that's there. Now the next thing we'd like to talk about is, so where do you start? Zero Trust is a big elephant. You look at all those different security categories, those areas that you have to consider. And one thing that had happened over the last 2 to 3 years is that companies have come out with frameworks. So NIST came out with, I think that's the special publication, it's what, 802.207, I believe. And then you have the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency came out with a framework, and that's really what you see here. Now this framework's important because it takes those building blocks that are there and then allows you to do an assessment. That assessment's just to determine where you're at against all those capabilities, all those technologies we had. So we talked to some customers that are like, we don't even have single sign-on nailed. We have single password, and everyone logs in with the same password on a lot of different machines. And we have others that are like, oh, they've got strong authentication, and they're even using risk scores to bring in. A large pharmaceutical customer of ours, they went through that journey of single password to when they added federation to do single sign-on across all of these. They added multi-factor authentication, and they added risk. And it gave them a way to sort of mature through that process as they brought identity forward. So you look at the framework, and then let's jump to the goals real quick. When you look at a Zero Trust maturity model, you really are looking not only at the technology, but also the operational framework within your organization. What this does is if you take a maturity assessment, the first thing you can do is develop an enterprise level strategy, because it allows you to know where to start, where you're most vulnerable, and where you're okay. It allows you to determine an execution roadmap, and we'll give you a journey of how we feel you should take that approach, but that execution roadmap gives you a plan, and then it also gives you a continuous delivery model. It really sets you up to where you can say, now I know where I need to deliver and what I need to maintain to be under a Zero Trust framework going forward. Now some of the outcomes of the program I think are important because it allows you to say, you know what, I've got buy-in from the executive team because I'm doing the assessment and then I'm building out the execution and plan to align to. It also lets me assess, I have some good technology. I think every one of the enterprise customers I work with all have something there that you can start with. It's mature, at least it's in a pretty good state. And it allows me to then take my existing technology and make it add value going forward. And it also lets me identify where I've got gaps, things I need to actually bring into the framework. And then last is, by taking this assessment approach, by taking a Zero Trust strategy, you can actually put in the framework and start to identify where am I mature enough operationally versus where I need to make some change. One thing to look at then is take that framework, take that assessment level, and this is a major eye chart, so I'm just going to highlight thematically so you can see it, but the material would be left for you to reference. But this gives you a way to look at, so from an identity standpoint, a company like Ping would help you go up that journey, ultimately go from password to multi-factor authentication to actually doing risk-based continuous authentication, something that I think is critical. A company like CrowdStrike would take you up the device path. It would take you from just a managed device to be able to know about the device and be able to lock down that device. And you can do that on each one of these categories going forward. And I think the framework gives you a way to say, I'm going to start, and all I want to do is get my identity to that kind of advanced level. But because our data is so critical, I'm going to get that up to the higher, more of that optimal state. So it gives you a framework to make some of those decisions. Anything to add?
No, I'll talk a little bit more about that aspect on one of my slides later.
All right. And then the last few things is you take that framework and then you need another place to start. It's really more of your implementation strategy. So our advice is that you build your implementation strategy on how to develop the best user experience. And so you take those same principles of establish and build trust, and then protect your resources. I know we have to do them at the same time, but from a maturity standpoint, if you can just really lock down and make sure the identity is authenticated and it's paired with the device, your ability to then make sure that they are the right user to be able to grant access to what they're entitled to is better. So we talked about establish, your authentication authority first. Next, you establish your authorization authority, so you not only can capture who they are coming in. Once that session's established, now I can manage the authorization in a continuous fashion. Once those are established, then you start to provide intelligence, so you go up that single sign-on to multi-factor authentication to risk. You can start to graduate and mature on that vein. And then always, just the more you can start to automate and provide that react respond framework, the more you can actually bring some maturity in the insight that you provide. We then can start to have a really kind of a security operations framework for your zero trust deployment. So last few things here, and I'm just trying to be sensitive to time, is that there are some capabilities that are necessary for what Ping believes is the modern identity capability. You need to start with verifiable credentials. That's for your employees. If you have a customer facing, make sure that you are introducing verifiable credentials to ensure that you know who they are. Those are really the implicit ways of authenticating someone. Profile management's critical. I can't tell you how many companies we've worked with that have been able to materially change how they operate by putting in progressive profiling. It allows you to then create a good experience, learn who they are, and be able to extend that. Risk signals. If there's anything that we've heard over the last 2 to 3 years is the more signals I have, the better I know who you are, and the better experience I can give you. You actually take a lot of friction, and then you imagine getting to that passwordless state where you don't require a password to authenticate can actually be achievable if you can actually have the right signals to, again, know who you are and then know is there any vulnerabilities or not. The last few things then is just multi-factor authentication, still very critical. But multi-factor authentication is becoming less and less explicit and starting to enable implicit controls. And so imagine if I know who you are, I know and trust the device, I know it's managed, I know I'm inside the firewall, I'm going to let you in. I know you well enough and I trust well enough that I can allow you a very seamless experience. Versus if you're brand new, you may or may not be a bot, I really don't know who you are, I'm going to require a lot more controls and I might require you to come in with a stronger authentication. And then last is just the things we talked about before, the authentication authority and then the authorization authority. So I'm going to click through a few slides fairly quickly, but just try to then tell that journey. So take those capabilities we talked about and then take that journey. First, we start with that authentication authority, and it really is just to centralize and provide single sign-on everything. You start to look at adding multi-factor authentication. You start to then identify and verify those users. Those are great starting points because, again, the better you know who the person is, you can grant them access to the resources that you want to protect. But beyond that, then you have some resources, and one of the most vulnerable places in an organization is their own people having access to some of the back-end systems, those admin accounts. And so privileged access is very important. But imagine a world if I could do single sign-on across everything and then add privileged accounts on top of that. I have a secure network for those infrastructure services that are there. And another thing to consider is then managing those devices. Next step then is once I've authenticated, I have a session established, now I need to provide continuous authentication through the flow. First thing is to centralize your access policies. Be able to have one place that the security architect controls and resources can come into that central authorization and say, may or may not access this application. That the authorization authority can also take signals. So it can take information and say, I will grant you access, but you know what? I've noticed you haven't accessed that application for a long time. It's been over a month. How about we step you up and make sure that you really are who you are before I grant you access? Even though you're entitled, I'm going to still check to see who you are. And then last is that you need to start working with the network enforcement layers. There's companies like Zscaler that sit at the edge, and they do a great job of interfacing with identity, provide protection to SaaS applications that are out on the public internet. So once we have the authentication authority, the authorization authority centralized, then we start to feed it. And this was really that story about that large pharmaceutical company. They got everything protected. The user experience wasn't great because they had a lot of explicit interfaces, a lot of authentication happening. But what they were able to do is start to gather more and more information that's really there for security principles to help make better decisions. And then what it now allowed them to do is then get to know the user as they can, allow them access when they feel that they know the user well, and then step up and provide unique policy when they don't. And then last is just that notion of once I've brought the signals in, ensure that you are working with some of those network providers to provide that security operating center, provide that ability to very easily react and respond and enforce certain policies. One example is, we work well with a lot of the network access gateways as well as the API gateways, and they become our enforcement point for policy. And it's been a good tool to protect APIs, to protect web resources or some data resources. So let me pause there, and I apologize if that felt rushed, but happy to answer questions or else we can talk to you downstairs. But I'm going to give Steve a few minutes to talk about how ping and CDW work together.
So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with CDW. We're like the largest security solutions and services provider in North America now. And when it comes down to the zero trust and what we work with ping as far as implementation services, managing them, sales, but CDW as a whole does everything on this eye chart. So when we're talking about identity, network security, data application, CDW can do that. Implementation services. The other thing that we provide is we have a zero trust rapid assessment. It takes about 2 weeks to complete, and we can give you a really good idea of where you stand with the zero trust as a whole, and then help you develop a plan to get to that to compliance with that framework. And in general, CDW across the board, even outside the zero trust, we can do everything from program a strategy. A lot of the customers that I talk to, I'm a field CISO. I talk with folks that a lot of them don't even have a security leader. That's the director of IT who's also acting on behalf of the security team. And so I help them build strategies around that, and even through training. And some of the training would probably be interesting to a lot of the folks here as I walked around downstairs, because it's all developed around security. So malware reverse engineering, and if you're a SOC, if you're like a SOC level 1 engineer, if you want to get to a SOC level 3 engineer, we can actually give you a test to find out where you're at, and then develop a training program that gets you up there to build your security skills up. But again, across secure infrastructure and everything that needs to deal with zero trust, because again, it's not just one thing. You may hear vendors say that if you use us, we can get you to zero trust compliance, but not one vendor's ever going to do that. But we can actually help implement multiple vendors and integrate them into a zero trust framework. And that's it. I'm done.
That's great. So, questions? Who felt that was rushed? Anyone? It's a lot of slides to get to, we understand, but we thought it would be good to be content rich. Leave it as leave behinds, give you the framework that you can work from. But any questions?
On one of your architecture diagrams, you had, kind of like how you split things up. You had the circle in the center with kind of the 5 areas, and you had a bunch of kind of dot map type branches coming out.
Yeah.
And then you showed a second version of that slide that had partner names on some of them. There were an awful lot of areas that had no partner names on there. What do you do to address those?
It's interesting how, I had one other slide that was way too busy that, we actually have partners in every one of those areas. This was more of the landscape to fit what I think are core. But take like the software-defined perimeter layer. We work with Akamai, we work with ClearTrust, we work with some others in those areas. So there's our companies that we work with those. And we found that there's these adjacencies, that some of them are far adjacencies in a different group, but we'll work with them. So if you'd like a follow-up, I can certainly share the full breadth of those partnerships that sort of map to it.
And I can tell you from my personal strategy is to look at what you're currently invested in and try to capitalize on that investment, what you've already built upon, and then finding the right partners to build around that to take up the other 4 pillars and integrate those together. And if you have something that is not going to be part of that framework very well, then we can set it out another way to where we'll end up getting, doing the entire implementation. But I like to see where you're at first and then find the right partners that integrate well, because some partners don't integrate well with others.
Is Palo Alto common among many other groups? Zscaler? Anyone on Zscaler? We're starting to hear Zscaler a little more. I think it's because of that SaaS application they have, that kind of edge piece. CrowdStrike? A few of them out there. Cloudflare? Has anyone heard of them? Cool. Yeah, I'd have to say it's been interesting to go through Zero Trust because you start to question, how much do I need of legacy environments versus bring them forward, and what we found is you do. It's just a matter of how do you best bring them together. There are some edge applications or technologies that I think are going away. I hate to say it, but even like the SIM vendors, I think are quickly being encapsulated or captured by the security orchestration automation response, I guess, the SOAR vendors. And those are like the Palo Altos. I think you'll see CrowdStrike positioning around those. There's this XDR frameworks. All those would be the kind of conversation we would have if we get into a little more detail. Any other questions? All right, it's 5 o'clock. You guys were good. You stuck with us, so I appreciate that. Really do. And if you have questions afterward, I'll come up.